Hey everyone, this video is a follow-up to the previous video, a thought experiment on heroism. If you haven't watched that video, go watch it, please. I have a wife to feed. So I asked you to engage with the questions I posited last episode. Is doing nothing in the name of moral purity itself a moral failing? Here's what y'all had to say. Jose Silva said, honestly, I often ask that question when I think about the no-kill rule many superheroes follow. I'm particularly upset about Batman not killing the Joker, because by this point, he has not only killed and tortured billions of people, but he's also killed Jason Todd, the second Robin, and crippled Barbara Gordon. Both of those characters are members of the Bat family, Bruce's family, and yet even after all this, he still refuses to break his one rule. This is one of the reasons why I love the new Amazon adult animated series Invincible, because there's an episode where the heroes are so hopelessly outmatched that three of them are left near dead. Once they realize this, the remaining heroes basically decide, fuck it, we're gonna kill the villains. And then they do with zero problems on a moral level. That's long been an issue with a lot of superhero comics. Now, Superman, I can understand having that code because realistically, the number of things that would call for Superman using more than 1% of his power are few and far between. Before comics went cosmic and weird, the threats were mundane, and Superman killing anyone would set a bad precedent. Batman, however, has no excuse for not killing the Joker, or the Penguin, or any of his supervillains. There's always been this weird double standard where Batman will take in the villains peacefully, but all the mooks guarding them get to give his fists a lovely kiss. Batman treats a megalomaniac who is determined to kill everyone in Gotham City the way the real-life police treat a white man with an assault rifle who's just killed 30 people. Batman should be treating the mooks this way. Most of them are just economically disenfranchised people who are desperate. I mean, how desperate do you have to be to work for the Penguin? But the thing about this rule is that it came about during the days of the Comics Code Authority, where they literally were not allowed to do anything else. That's where all this all-sparing hero template comes from. It's literally a fear-mongering mandate to avoid government regulation from conservative politicians. In fact, you can actually read a lot of the criteria for the Comics Code Authority and realize most of them, particularly the ones regarding crime, police, and non-straight people, are literally just the tropes of comics. It might be defunct, but many of its criteria are baked into superhero comics at their very core. Except the one about women needing to be drawn realistically. I don't think that was ever enforced. If you dig long enough, a lot of the good morals you find in 2010s media can be traced back to similar roots. The first Akiro, oh hi Akiro. The first Akiro said, when it comes to killing the bad guy, a villain, I think the intent is the most important factor in regards to if it's good or not. If killing this evil person prevents the suffering of others, then objectively it's better than letting them live. IMO, the only time killing of a bad guy or evil person should be something to worry about is in the context of what are the consequences that come from that action. Hypothetically speaking, if you kill a guard that's abusing a refugee, do the other guards begin to treat the refugees worse? Does this take time away from the hero now having to deal with the escalating situation when her valuable time is already being stretched thin? Does her detractors use this as propaganda against her and paint the guard in a disingenuous light, using his family for that purpose? I'm a firm believer of death to tyrants, but from a writing or real life perspective, the consequences of those acts of violence should always be put into account. There's nothing wrong with killing an evil bastard, but if a story is going to tackle subjects like this, they need to be prepared to depict the aftermath and consequences that could follow. It's interesting how a lot of people took the trolley problem and interpreted it as killing a villain alone. Admittedly, I did use the topic of villains a lot in this regard, but interesting thing about the trolley problem itself is that you're not killing a villain, you're killing an innocent person. Any reasonable person believes death to tyrants. The people who don't are not thinking rationally. They have their fucking head in the clouds and are acting out a pacifist power fantasy because apparently that's a group of words that make sense and begs no questions. Or they're dishonest and in service of tyrants and they're gaslighting you. Is that uncharitable? Maybe. Do I care? Not really. In regards to killing tyrants and how it affects your standing, it's not necessarily a zero-sum system. New Vegas did something really well with this, where you could just kill Caesar's Legion soldiers with impunity, and the end result is your reputation with them drops and they send more people after you, but your reputation with almost every other faction rises as a result. Sure, the Legion is angry with you, but the NCR, the Strip, and most other settlements like you a lot more. In regards to Ray killing that cop, sure, the Senate might view her in an increasingly negative light, but that refugee is alive to spread the word of what actually happened. And the end result is that the people are inspired by those actions, and that has a knock-on effect. At that point, you have to decide whether your reputation with the oppressed is more important than your reputation with the oppressor. Side note, I do appreciate how many people engage with that fanfiction example seriously. I was back and forth on whether or not I was going to actually do it because it's a little ridiculous to cite your own work as an example, but it was the only time I got to see people making many of these arguments in real time in an environment where the work in question wasn't already on their side. So I do appreciate appreciate your indulging me. GD says, on the killing of someone who indulges in a corrupt system. The focus in the thought experiment is whether they deserve punishment. Interesting, sure, but it's worth asking how people get to that point. That's a lot more fascinating. Why would someone support the system? Is it because they enjoy a position of economic or social dominance? Have people told them all their lives it's okay? And how does someone grow up or around a corrupt system and still become a rebel against it? Have they or people they know been personally hurt? The questions of how people get to these points is a lot more interesting, at least to me. The problem with that sentiment is that's the opinion everyone pretends to have. Everyone goes, I would love to know how they got to this point, but realistically speaking, it's not some noble ideal that drives people to support tyranny. Usually it's idiocy or a lust for power. You hear people often say power for the sake of power is an unrealistic goal and people don't work like that, but tyrants of all shapes and sizes do in fact work like that. You'll often hear from people that the Great Depression caused the rise of Nazis and the Holocaust. It didn't. In reality, the Nazi leaders were a bunch of alienated weirdos obsessed with problematic juvenilia that they never grew out of. Most of the ground level supporters of authoritarianism don't have some twisted backstory. They're just people who are so unbelievably stupid that they think people with different skin colors and religions are going to suck your adrenal fluid to achieve immortality. And authoritarians pander to them. In fiction, highly educated so-called elitists turn out to be Hannibal Lecter. But in real life, cannibal serial killers do not have such a refined background. The notion of a villain with very complex motivations and origins is a lot like the cycle of abuse. It's a lot rarer than pop culture makes it look. Furthermore, it's still in the same problem of giving undue attention to the oppressor over the oppressed. This was something the sequel trilogy's canon did to disastrous effect, spending so much of the second and third films on Kylo Ren despite the fact that we had all sorts of oppressed people to actually make the focus of the story. It uses child soldier slave armies as the backdrop for the First Order's evil, and even gives us a main character from that army, but then just leaves it by the wayside and continues to use stormtroopers as cannon fodder, even though, realistically speaking, treating them like cannon fodder is actually fucking horrible. Again, the mooks are treated as disposable while their leader isn't. It's the Batman problem again. It shows us little urchin children being enslaved by space capitalism and then never does anything with them. People praise The Last Jedi for this moment, completely ignoring the fact that this was the same film where Space Hitler gets upgraded to a lead role for reasons. To me, focusing on why the oppressor is like this over the emancipation of the oppressed is extremely wrong-headed. I know you were told in your literature class that your villains have to be complex or sympathetic, otherwise they're bad writing, but that's never been true, and the teacher who told you that is a moron. If it works, it's not bad writing, and a writer may decide not to give those things any weight because they don't think they're important. Storymaster said, moral purity is such a lame-ass dilemma for any protagonist to have. When a character has to make a choice between two or more bad outcomes, choose the lesser evil and deal with whatever consequences that follow, it can become one of the most singularly interesting stories and character developments in any media. The hero's third way out of no consequences is such a lazy writing, and it always gets told because people are so scared of their stories not ending up wrapped in a nice neat bow. In truth, this is probably it more often than not, the fear of leaving loose ends. Interestingly, Mass Effect 3, a game notorious for its fix-everything endings, does do something interesting with this. In order to get the fix-everything endings to all the little mini-plots, you have to have not lost certain crewmates in the previous game. One moment involves the Geth and the Quarians. If Tali and the Legion are both alive, you're able to convince the Quarians to make peace with the Geth. Only there are two variations of that, Paragon and Renegade. The Paragon speech is your usual Steven Universe inspirational speech to inspire the Quarians to make peace with the Geth.
No. Nobody else dies today. Legion, keep going.
Shepard?
All ships, this is Commander Shepard. The Reaper is dead. Stand down.
This is Admiral Talizora. Shepard speaks with my authority.
And mine as well. Negative. We can win this war now. Keep firing.
60%.
The Geth are about to return to full strength. If you keep attacking, they'll wipe you out. Your entire history is you trying to kill the Geth. You forced them to rebel. You forced them to ally with the Reapers.
80%.
The Geth don't want to fight you. If you can believe that for just 1 minute, this war will be over. You have a choice. Please. Keela Salai.
The Renegade speech, however...
Ah, hell. Legion, keep going.
Shepard?
Everyone listen up. This is Shepard. If you don't want to be blown out of the sky in about half a minute, stand down now.
This is Admiral Talizora. Shepard speaks with my authority.
And mine as well. Negative. We can win this war now. Keep firing.
60%.
The Geth are about to return to full strength. If you keep attacking, they'll wipe you out. A few years ago, I saved you from the Geth at the Citadel. Just recently, I helped you take out that dreadnought.
80%.
But I'm through saving you. If you keep attacking, I will stand and watch while the Geth lay you to waste. It's your call. Kila Salai.
All units, hold fire.
Beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. I have a special love for this, as I mentioned when I talked about similar peaceful solutions through threats options in the Old Republic. It is technically finding a peaceful solution by intimidating someone into submission, even though most people don't really see it as such. An example of good is not nice, so to speak. Most of the Renegade options in the Mass Effect series are like this, and in the third game can reflect Shepard's growing frustration as she runs all over the galaxy solving people's problems while their own planet burns, and they're still obsessed with their petty political maneuvering in the face of galactic annihilation.
I hate secrets and politicians, Primarch. Your son had to die to fix this.
It's a very interesting character moment where her frustration and anger just spills over to just saying, I'm done. Either you make peace or I stand here and watch you die. And it works. And because of this nice hero, mean anti-hero binary, we lose out on the potential for a lot of interesting character moments like this. Even most people who play Mass Effect don't even think about these little things and instead blindly play all Paragon or all Renegade. I think there's a lot of value in considering every choice from the perspective of the character's personality and what they've been through. Quinn Myers said, I would argue on the side of consequentialism, despite how controversial it can be, and I agree with you in saying that inaction in and of itself is an action. Whether or not you act, you had to make a choice and therefore are accountable for all the effects. I'm not going to read all of this because he goes on to list a dilemma about a doctor having to harvest organs from a living person to save the lives of 5 other people, and it's not very well thought out. I included this one not because it was interesting, but because of how beautifully it missed the point. Quinn here cites a similar philosophical problem regarding organ harvesting in regards to consequentialism, yet fails to realize the futility of that. You can't just harvest organs out of one person and transfer them into another. Blood and tissue tests have to be done for them to even be a match, and most places that have the technology to do vital organ transplants also have the methods in place to find donors. Healthy organs are harvested from people who have died and registered as donors every single day, and very few people are not registered for this. You don't need to specifically look at the problem on the side of consequentialism, and this goes for everyone who said something along the lines of, it depends on the situation. Yeah, it obviously depends on the situation. That was my point, to get people thinking in more than binary personal good or evil, because a lot of storytelling just flat out doesn't do this. It adheres to a very rigid notion of morality in all situations, regardless of context. Reiterating this is repeating everything I said, but wordier and pretending you're contributing to the conversation. Tortoise of Legends said, this conversation made me think of the character Samara from Mass Effect. She's very similar to Amorosa in the sense that her code is extremely absolute. If she sees somebody committing an injustice, her duty is to end their life without trial or investigation. Her code has no moral grays. Either something is a good action or it is bad. The problem is that she herself admits she doesn't want context surrounding the crime she witnesses. If she executes a murderer, she doesn't want to know if the crime was committed because the victim was abusing their family. She's afraid of the guilt involved with acknowledging the complexity. And I think that's very selfish. Not acknowledging the good you've taken away from the world, only patting yourself on the back for stopping the bad. Like in the example of the Coruscant Guard, he may have had a family and children he was lovely to. No doubt that killing him saves countless future victims, and I would disagree with the character for killing him on the spot. However, if the character is ignoring that he's more than just the abuser we see, then that is a form of willful ignorance. Okay, first of all, Samara is not similar to Amorosa. Amorosa doesn't operate on an absolutist code. Anyway, Samara is an interesting character in regards to what is essentially lawful good, and in order to get her to not do very stupid things, like kill herself to avoid killing her last daughter because something Ardat Yakshi, you have to essentially rules lawyer your way out of it. Samara is an interesting look at a lawful good character because her entire story is very sad, tragic even, and you can't help but see this absolutist adherence to the Justicar code as some kind of unhealthy coping mechanism, to blindly follow the code entirely to take the responsibility off your own shoulders. Interestingly enough, if you finish the game with her alive, she seems to move beyond this and is spending time with Falaire, which is nice. By contrast, the point Tortoise brings up regarding the Coruscant Guard is interesting because, statistically speaking, most police officers abuse their families. But here's another layer. A lot of people can claim that the Coruscant Guard is more than the abuser we first see, but if you reach the point where you're abusing a position of authority to harass and hurt others, does it really matter who you are off duty? I don't believe for a second that the kind of person who would strangle someone to death at work is somehow a nicer person off duty. But even if they are, does that really matter? Should that matter to anyone, especially the victim? It's not a form of willful ignorance to not give a shit about the quality of someone's character while they're willfully hurting another person. At what point does it become acceptable for Ray to not give a shit about anything else? In a situation like this, you have to choose between the victim and the abuser. And if you don't choose the victim, you're a pretty crap Jedi. Annie Musician said, "My view on this is gonna seem reductive, but it's how I see it. Inaction is an action. You choose not to do something when you had the ability and opportunity, choosing some lofty morals over the actual safety of most people. The idea of violence begets violence is such an invasive idea because of the moral superiority that comes with not fighting against injustice while not offering tangible solutions to the very problems. Whenever the trolley problem gets brought up, I usually hear people try to rationalize adding, what if the one person was insert important person here? Would you still do it? Which is just a dodge from the real question and having to make a choice. I think if the piece of media wants to talk about extremist pacifism, it needs to show the consequences of doing nothing but spouting platitudes to people that need help. That choosing inaction is effectively siding with the oppressor. That choosing non-violence and to not do anything against violent people will only result in more corpses. I've encountered a similar problem. It is extremely common when presented with the trolley problem for someone to ask, is the one person a Nazi? In order to get the point across, I'll ask in turn, would them being a Nazi make the choice to pull the lever easier to make and easier to live with? And when they say yes, because they always do, I go, then he is not a Nazi. Trying to rework the trolley problem to make it so that pulling the lever also happens to kill a horrible person is to completely miss the point of it. The whole point is to discuss the ethics of doing nothing, not to make the choice to do something easier to make. And all this wriggling and asking for content skips over that because they're trying to salvage their ego. They're still positioning their view of themselves as a good person as the most important thing in the room. They want to come out of it feeling good about themselves, and it's designed so that you can't do that. The trolley problem is about the ethics of doing nothing because pulling the lever is the only right decision, but it's a decision where you have to live with the guilt of what you've done. It's a decision that doesn't make you feel good about yourself, and so a lot of people are inclined to do nothing and wash their hands of responsibility because that's easier. It still positions your own feelings over the lives of other people. I would pull the lever, and I would hate myself for doing it for the rest of my life. And that's the part that trips so many people up. Therotrazit said, "My summarized viewpoints on good deeds are this. The important thing about good deeds is that they're done. If something is preventing the good deed from being done, then any goodwill is null and void. Also, don't do good deeds solely to expect a reward for it. That is selfish." Recently, I found out that the facility my brother is in, that one of the inmates was blackmailing the other inmates for money, including my brother. The supervisors knew about it, but didn't do anything to stop it. Their excuse was that they're understaffed. They still had plenty of opportunities to do something about it, but they didn't. Thanks to their inactions, my brother had a mental breakdown and was transferred to a psychiatric ward. This goes to highlight the problem of inaction in a hostile situation. By not doing anything, you hurt more people by proxy. Another facet of this that I find interesting is that a lot of heroes that end up having this never kill anyone belief come from very sheltered and privileged backgrounds like Steven and Batman. In the DC universe, there's this hero Apollo who doesn't believe that and makes sure that the victims are ensured that their abusers will never harm anyone again. By not killing their villains and just putting them temporarily away, they're ensuring that more people will eventually be hurt. And his reasoning is that because those heroes come from privileged backgrounds, they are unable to truly empathize with the victims of the villains, since they have never been personally victimized themselves, at least before they started as heroes. This is why villains always go after people that the hero is close to, because they can only hurt them by proxy. Their personal lives are so perfect. Just look at Steven. He has a house to himself, 3 loving guardians, and a loving father. Gets a girlfriend, is beloved by his hometown, and gets more friends. A point you made is that the Diamonds personally abused everyone in the main cast except Steven. A lot of so-called good people tend to be unwilling to do any personal sacrifices to do good deeds because it might inconvenience their lives in some way. They only like the praise they get from being called a good person by everyone else. This one here makes my point for me in a lot of ways, particularly the remark about characters like Steven and how it ties back to ego I mentioned above. I used to know people like this. My ex was really bad about this, in fact. She was so wrapped up in the idea of herself as a good person, but that didn't manifest in her trying to be a good person, just sulking and moping when the reality that she wasn't was brought in front of her. It's blatant narcissism, and a lot of these so-called heroes are themselves blatant narcissists, and their creators tend to be equally self-absorbed. A lot of morality you'll find, not just in cartoons, but in a lot of storytelling, is about prioritizing yourself first and foremost, about letting yourself off the hook. It's one of the reasons you tend to see white liberals completely fucking stall in regards to their own self-improvement, in regards to things like racism, because they've invested so much ego in the idea of themselves as one of the good ones that they become my ex-fiancé, sulking and moping and getting exceedingly defensive at the admittedly very tame reality that they're not as perfect as they thought they were, which leads to defensiveness in a bid to preserve one's own ego. Easier to convince yourself that everyone else is being performative than accept the reality that you might have something to learn. Getting out of that mire of prioritizing your own ego over the people you might be hurting is not as difficult as people like to make it look, but ego is so important to them that they'll trample over anyone to preserve it, which is why you can have a content creator get banned from Twitch for calling for Jewish civilians to be nuked off the face of the earth, and then turn around and scream at black women over imagined claims of perpetuating white genocide, two things that would normally tell you, oh, that's a Nazi, but good luck convincing LeftTube of that. Pfft, what? That's ridiculous. We de-radicalized Nazis. We're not being radicalized. Now excuse me while I spend the next 4 hours on a podcast with these 5 Nazis being immersed in everything they believe. Surely my only interacting with other problematic white people and never speaking to a person of color except to hurl accusations at them isn't unhealthy in the slightest. Why are you harshing my squee? You know, because apparently leftism is a fandom now. Lyolith said, "The moment you choose to do nothing when you fully have the ability to do anything to prevent, circumvent, or otherwise better the situation, it's entirely your fault. It's so much the person's fault that they attempt to avoid guilt by coming up with moral excuses. They are just that, excuses. Much in the same manner in which a lazy person comes up with reasons as to why they haven't done anything that was asked of them, a morally bankrupt person will come up with moral reasons to why they cannot do a basic human decency and help. The individualist philosophy of capitalism endorses this kind of behavior by providing self-serving excuses to avoid rallying to help others. That's the real tea here. Individualistic philosophies actively promote avoidance of moral responsibility. That's how human atrocities happen. That's how the Jews, the LGBTA, the political prisoners, the disabled, and people of color of Nazi Germany got annihilated, because people had the fundamental moral failing of neglecting to help others. Now there's something I hadn't considered. The idea that this self-centered playing to ego is actually capitalist propaganda in disguise to coerce people into thinking only of themselves and not of others. This would explain why so many people responded to a situation where it was impossible to feel good about themselves by trying to manipulate it to preserve that good feeling. It's darkly similar to how billionaires will donate tokens amounts of money for the sake of a tax break and reputation when they could give a lot more and still have more money than anyone knows what to do with. Or hell, the fact that donating to charity has to be incentivized with tax breaks at all. We can afford to give everyone plenty of food and a place to live at no cost to them. That's not a pie-in-the-sky belief. We can literally do that today. But the idea of doing something at cost to ourselves with no immediate or even promise of reward in turn is so profane to so many people. The very idea of money only works on the basis of being able to lord it over people who don't have a lot of it and say, I'm better than you. It's why just giving people equal amounts of money causes rapid inflation and destroys the economy, because the economy runs on greed and vanity. Star Trek does something interesting with this, in that in the 24th century, humanity has moved to an economy that is less based on accumulation of wealth and was instead focused on self-improvement, self-enrichment, and the betterment of all. And fans of Star Trek have had a hard time wrapping their heads around the idea of an economy that doesn't focus on money. But the reason it works is very simple. Humans just aren't greedy, vain assholes anymore, and so money has no value because money is a social construct. 20th century humans don't value wealth in and of itself, and so capitalism cannot survive. And a lot of people can't wrap their heads around that. Ebony Radcliffe said, I think it also plays a huge role in if killing is made good or bad. Like, if you see a fascist and you kill them to remove them from power, it does directly stop the suffering of people. Then absolutely that should be what is considered a morally good murder. However, on that same flip side, I think killing a fascist that already has people in place to replace them at the drop of a hat is morally wrong. If killing the tyrant leads to no changes and another equal tyrant is put in their place, you've done nothing to help people, but you have given the following generations ammunition to further instill a fear of opposition. Which, hell, that could even make the situation worse for the people you were trying to help. Some of these I included because they were thought-provoking, but this one I included just so I could say, what, do we have a one dead fascist limit? This goes back to the people trying really hard to avoid the question of the trolley problem raises. Trying so hard to find a situation where killing the bad guy would be morally wrong that you end up with this, as if we can only kill one fascist. I get you're trying to make a point about how murder can be an ego trip, but this isn't it. When you're given an open-ended thought experiment with a relatively simple question, this kind of fussing over details feels to me like you're missing the point. When you're layering contrivance after contrivance onto a situation that is already a contrivance, come back, you've missed the forest for the trees. It sounds less like you're trying to convince me than you are trying to convince yourself. Well, this was an interesting exercise. Sorry I couldn't get to everyone, but I try not to make these videos too long if I can help it. But it was fascinating to see how many people just flat out said, yes, doing nothing is wrong, and how many people were trying desperately to preserve their own ego in this hypothetical situation. It's given me thoughts on how to talk about morality and redemption arcs in the future. I hadn't considered that capitalist society and its primary focus on accumulating wealth and status for the sake of vanity had a hand in this egocentric view of morality. But upon hearing it, it made complete sense. We are taught to be selfish and prioritize our ego from an early grade. From being the top student to getting valedictorian to getting that scholarship, which is essentially competing for the right to get an education, to inevitably the job market, we're always tacitly put in competition with our peers and then taught to value our egos over anything else. It certainly explains why BreadTube has been going down the shithole and why so many self-described progressive white people get so nasty when their biases are encountered. Ego. So there was a lot to think about there, and even to the people who did fall into that trap gave me a lot to think about as well. This was actually why I used the Sith Resurgence as an example in the last video, because people more often than not who want to defend shitty morality plays will just repeat what the show I was criticizing says. But as I said earlier, there was something interesting in watching people try to push that same morality in real time in regards to work that wasn't already reinforcing it for them, indicating that they only believe these things because the things they watched growing up told them to believe it. I may do more thought experiments like this in the future. Thanks to everyone who engaged with this experiment. I'm sorry again that I could only get to a fraction of you, and I hope you have a fantastic day.